The snowstorm was unlike any I had ever witnessed in my 67 harsh winters. In this remote village of ours, it was like a living entity. A colossal, enraged white beast, roaring and clawing at our rooftops, flinging razor-sharp snowflakes into every crack, every crevice it could find. The wind howled through the empty chimneys, carrying an eerie lament that seemed to seep deep into our very bones. We, the villagers of Ashworth, had huddled within our timber and stone cottages, the meager flames in our hearths our only line of defense against the biting cold and the endless darkness of the storm-racked night. I am Elias, an old blacksmith, my hands now more gnarled and trembling than strong and steady as they once were. But my eyes are still sharp, and my memory, though sometimes treacherous, still holds the stories of the village. From the small, frost-covered window of my cottage, I could see a sliver of the village square, now a roiling sea of white under the faint, flickering light of a few remaining lanterns struggling against the storm's fury. Most everyone was indoors, daring not to face nature's wrath, to venture out on a night like this, as everyone knew, was tantamount to seeking death itself. This winter had been particularly severe. Prolonged cold spells had depleted our meager reserves. The wild game seemed to have vanished, hiding deep within the dark old wood, a place even the bravest hunters hesitated to enter when the snow lay thick. The fish in the river were frozen solid. The potatoes and turnips in our cellars dwindled daily, and the gaunt, hollowed faces of my neighbors were clear testament to the growing scarcity. In times like these, a loaf of bread was not merely food, it was hope. It was life. It was the promise of another day. And that was why, when the piercing shriek of Mistress Martha, wife of Thomas the miller, tore through the growling of the storm, a cold sense of unease crept into every cottage, colder even than the wind and snow outside. At first, I wasn't sure what I'd heard. The wind could play strange tricks on the ears. But then it came again, clearer this time, a tormented cry of loss and fury. I saw the light of Master Thomas' lantern bobbing frantically outside their cottage window. Then their door burst open, flinging a gust of snow inside. Master Thomas rushed out, his face flushed with anger and the cold, clad only in a thin shirt. Who has done this?" he bellowed, his voice hoarse, barely audible above the wind. "Who dared to steal our bread? A loaf of bread, on a night like this?" The thought was horrifying. Theft was rare enough in Ashworth. We were a small community, bound together by necessity and tradition. But to steal food, especially bread, in a lean winter such as this, was an unimaginable crime, a betrayal of every basic rule of survival and neighborly decency. Soon, despite the storm, other doors began to creak open. Pale, worried faces peered out from the darkness. People called to one another, whispers carrying bewilderment and fear from house to house. Someone had stolen the miller's last loaf of bread, the loaf Mistress Martha had carefully baked that afternoon, the loaf they had planned to share among their 3 small children for breakfast the next morning. It had been placed on the inner windowsill to cool, a seemingly safe place, in a village where people trusted one another. Clearly, that trust had been misplaced. I hastily pulled on my thickest woolen cloak, donned my old, worn leather cap, and lit my storm lantern. My old hands trembled as I struck the flint, not just from the cold, but from a creeping sense of foreboding. I had to go out. As one of the oldest men in the village, and one who had served as village elder for many years, I felt a measure of responsibility. When I stepped into the square, the snow was already knee-deep. The wind whipped at my face, carrying tiny ice particles that stung my skin like needles. A small group of villagers had gathered outside Master Thomas' house, figures huddled together under the weak, flickering light of a few swaying lanterns. The air was thick with tension and anger. "It's gone," Mistress Martha sobbed, her thin shoulders shaking violently. "The warm loaf. I just took it from the oven." I only turned my back for a moment to see to the children. his eyes scanning the shadowy faces of his neighbors as if searching for the culprit's mark. Someone must have crept and he ground out. A coward. A starving sewer rat. As chaotic as the storm itself. At first, they were vague conjectures, perhaps a daring fox, or a feral dog, but no one truly believed it. An animal could not unlatch a window, even a loose one. This had to be the act of a human. Someone among us. And then, a name began to be uttered. At first a whisper, then growing louder, like a collective accusation. A name that, sadly, was always the first to surface whenever something unfortunate happened in the village. Elric. Young Elric. An orphan child, perhaps 12 or 13 years of age, as thin and reclusive as a shadow. His parents had died in a winter fever many years ago, leaving him alone in the world. Our village, as was custom, had tried to take him in, but tried was a relative term. Elric belonged to no one, and therefore, he belonged to everyone, but in the most negative sense. He slept in the old, dilapidated granary behind the church, doing odd jobs in exchange for scraps of leftover food that people offered as charity. He was always gaunt, his clothes ragged, his large, dark eyes always held a look of wariness, like a small wild animal ever ready to flee. I knew Elric. I had seen him grow up, or rather, struggle to grow up, amidst the indifference, sometimes the scorn, of the village. He was a quiet child, often keeping to himself, and possessed an uncanny ability to appear and disappear like a wisp of smoke. Perhaps it was that reclusiveness, that difference, that made him an easy target for rumors and suspicion. It must have been young Elric. A hoarse voice called out from the crowd. It was Master Giles, a farmer with a hard face and a perpetually sour disposition. I saw him loitering around here near dusk. His eyes are always as hungry as a wolf's. As always hungry. A warm loaf of bread would be too great a temptation for one like him. Each person seemed to have a story, a small piece of damning evidence, to bolster their suspicion. Someone recalled seeing Elric staring intently at their kitchen window. Another recounted how the boy had once been caught stealing an apple from their orchard last autumn. Minor transgressions from the past were now magnified, used as proof of a greater crime. A sense of unease stirred within me. Elric might be a difficult child, might have committed petty acts out of hunger, but to steal an entire loaf of bread from a struggling family, on a storm night like this, it didn't seem like the boy I knew. The boy who, though reclusive, had never struck me as malicious. We cannot be certain. I spoke up, my voice old and a little shaky, yet I tried to maintain a calm demeanor. It is dark, and the storm is fierce. There might be another explanation. The crowd was dominated by anger and the fear of impending starvation. They needed someone to hold responsible, an object for their wrath. And Elric, the orphan with no one to defend him, was too perfect a target. Another explanation, Elias. Master Thomas sneered, his eyes still glinting with fury. Bread doesn't just grow legs and walk away. And who among us is hungry enough to do such a vile thing? Except that whelp. Aimed directly at Elric while simultaneously affirming the innocence of everyone else present. A heavy silence fell over the crowd as they looked at each other, each wondering if any among them dared to question the word of the man who had just been robbed. We must find him, Master Giles declared, his voice resolute. If he stole the bread, he can't have gone far in this storm. He must be hiding somewhere, stuffing his greedy belly. They began to move, their lanterns swaying, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the snow. They were going to find Elric. A manhunt in the storm. A chill ran down my spine. and this time it wasn't from the snow. I had lived long enough to know that when a crowd is driven by fear and anger, reason is often left behind, and the victims are usually the weakest, those with no one to protect them. Wait, I tried to intervene once more, placing a hand on Master Thomas' arm. We should calm ourselves. The boy, if it truly was him, is just a hungry child. Perhaps we should. Elias. Master Thomas brushed my hand away. His voice as sharp as a knife. Forgive him. Let him continue to steal from honest folk who are struggling to survive. A crime must be punished. Especially this kind of crime. Raising his lantern high, spread out. Search every nook and cranny. The granary. The old church. Anywhere a rat like him might burrow. We will find him. And we will take back what is ours. They were no longer familiar neighbors. They had transformed into a hunting pack, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. Fueled by hunger and their own righteous indignation, they dispersed, their lanterns like eerie will-o'-the-wisps in the snowstorm, beginning their hunt for young Elric. I stood there, alone in the now empty square, the snow still falling relentlessly, the wind still screaming. My words had carried no weight. My age and the respect I once commanded seemed to have vanished into the fury of the winter night. I watched the distant lights recede, feeling a profound despair. I didn't know if Elric had truly stolen the bread. Perhaps he had. Hunger can drive people to desperate acts. But even if so, the punishment the crowd intended for him seemed far crueler than his crime. I returned to my small cottage, the cold of the storm night seeming to have seeped deep into my soul. The fire in my hearth had almost died, only a few embers glowing faintly. I sat down on my old wooden chair, listening to the wind howl outside and the heavy beat of my own heart. I thought of Elric, a solitary child, facing the wrath of an entire village. I thought of the missing bread, a small symbol of the fragility of our lives, of how easily order and trust could be shattered when people were pushed to the brink. Sleep did not come to me that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the images of angry faces, swaying lanterns, and the large, frightened eyes of an orphan boy. The wind outside seemed to carry a muffled cry, or perhaps that was just the imagination of a tired and helpless old man. I knew only one thing for certain, that loaf of bread, whether found or not, whether Elric was the culprit or not, had already left a crack in our community. A crack that, I feared, would not be easily mended, even when the snowstorm finally passed and the sun shone again. Because on that dark and frozen night, what was more fearsome than hunger or the storm was the suspicion and fear that had crept into the hearts of the villagers of Ashworth. And Elric, the accused boy, was merely its first victim. Chapter 1 of this tragedy had only just begun. The storm, that white-fanged beast which had terrorized us through the night, finally exhausted its fury with the coming of dawn. It retreated with a sullen growl, leaving behind a world transformed, sculpted into eerie drifts and silent, snow-laden sentinels. The sun, when it eventually pierced the tattered gray clouds, cast a pale, indifferent light upon Ashworth, a light that seemed to illuminate not warmth or hope, but the stark, frozen reality of our predicament and the even colder atmosphere that had settled upon us. In the storm's wake, the hunt for young Elric, fueled by Master Thomas' rage and the collective hunger-sharpened fear of the villagers, had proven fruitless. Or, perhaps, inconclusive would be a more accurate term. They had scoured the granary, its dusty corners yielding nothing but cobwebs and the scurrying of unseen vermin. They had poked into the shadowed recesses of the old, disused part of the church, their lanterns casting wild, dancing shadows that played tricks on overwrought imaginations. But Elric was not to be found. Some claimed to have seen fleeting footprints leading towards the old wood, but none dared follow into that ancient, brooding expanse, especially not after such a night. Others whispered that he must have an accomplice, someone who had hidden him, Or worse, that the thief was indeed still among us, more cunning than a mere orphan boy. By the time the first watery light of morning painted the sky, the hunting party had straggled back, cold, weary, and with their anger now curdled into a sullen, fearful resentment. The missing bread remained missing, Elric remained unfound, and in the vacuum of resolution, something else, something far more insidious, began to take root. I watched from my window as the village slowly, painfully, came back to a semblance of life. Or rather, a semblance of wary animation. The previous night's collective fury had dissipated, leaving behind a residue of weariness and a palpable, unspoken tension. Doors that had been thrown open in anger were now opened only a crack, eyes peering out cautiously before a figure would emerge, hunched against the biting morning air. There were no cheerful greetings exchanged, no communal assessment of the storm's damage. Instead, there was a strange, pervasive quiet, a quiet that felt heavier, more oppressive than even the deepest drifts of snow. No one dared to speak the truth. Or perhaps, no one knew what the truth was anymore. Was Elric guilty? Had he, a child driven by the gnawing pangs of starvation, truly committed such a desperate act? Or was he merely a convenient scapegoat, a sacrifice to the village's collective fear and hunger? The questions hung in the frigid air, unspoken, unanswered, yet felt by all. To voice doubt about Elric's guilt now, after the night's fervent accusations, would be to implicitly accuse someone else, someone present, someone with a family and a standing, however meager, in our small community. And in these desperate times, such an accusation was a dangerous thing indeed. Everyone was secretive. It began with the small things. Widow Elmsworth, whose cottage stood opposite mine, usually left her shutters open a crack to catch the morning light. Today, they remained firmly closed. When young Peter, the cobbler's son, ventured to the well, he carried his bucket with a new, furtive haste, his eyes darting left and right, as if he feared being watched, or worse, accosted. I saw him glance towards my own cottage, his gaze lingering for a moment too long, and I felt a cold prickle on my skin. Was he suspicious of me? An old blacksmith, living alone, my own stores undoubtedly meager, but perhaps, in his frightened mind, not meager enough. The conversations, when they occurred at all, were clipped, guarded. I attempted to speak with Master Giles, the farmer who had been so vocal in his accusations against Elric the night before. I found him by his small, snow-laden pigsty, his breath pluming in the cold air as he scattered a handful of scraps. A hard night, Giles, I offered, my voice raspy. He grunted, not meeting my eye. I no sign of the boy. Then he straightened, his face hard, his eyes narrowed. Hell turn up, or he won't. Makes little difference. The bread's still gone. He turned his back on me then. A clear dismissal, and busied himself with the pigs, his movements stiff with an unspoken resentment. It was the same throughout the village. The easy camaraderie, the shared burden of hardship that had, in past winters, bound us together, seemed to have evaporated overnight. Now, there was only a brittle civility, a veneer of normalcy stretched thin over a festering wound of mistrust. People moved with a new self-consciousness, their bodies held tight, as if physically guarding their thoughts, their possessions, their very selves from the prying eyes of their neighbors. And the eyes. That was perhaps the most unsettling change. Suspicious glances began to spread throughout the village like a contagion, more virulent, in its own way, than any winter fever. When two people passed in the narrow, snow-cleared paths, their eyes would meet for a fleeting second, not in recognition, but in a quick, calculating assessment, a flicker of doubt, a hint of accusation. Then, they would look away, hurrying on their separate, solitary paths. I saw it in the way Mistress Martha, her face still pale and tear-streaked, clutched her remaining children close when anyone approached her cottage, her gaze sweeping over them with a fierce, protective terror that seemed to include even old friends. I saw it in the way men gathered in hushed, furtive knots of 2 or 3, their voices dropping to inaudible murmurs if anyone else drew near, their heads closed together, their eyes darting around before they quickly dispersed, as if caught in some illicit act. The scarcity of food, of course, fueled this burgeoning paranoia. Every meager hoard, every carefully rationed portion, became a source of potential envy, of suspicion. Did old man Hemlock truly have as little grain as he claimed? Or was he hiding a sack away in his cellar? Had Widow Elmsworth shared all of her husband's dried meat? Or was she keeping the best cuts for herself? These unspoken questions festered, poisoning the well of our community from within. Even I, Elias, who had lived among these people my entire life, who had shod their horses, mended their plows, and shared their joys and sorrows, was not immune. I felt the weight of those suspicious glances, the subtle shift in a neighbor's greeting from warmth to a guarded formality, my solitary status, my lack of a wife or children to feed, which had once elicited a kind of gentle pity, now perhaps marked me as someone with less to lose, or more to hide. The few chickens I kept, their eggs a precious supplement to my diet, now felt like a liability, a potential target for desperate, covetous eyes. I found myself bolting my own door with a new, unaccustomed firmness, a feeling of shame mingling with the cold knot of fear in my stomach. The missing bread had become a symbol, a focal point for all our anxieties. It was no longer just about a single act of theft, a single hungry child. It was about the gnawing fear of starvation, the erosion of trust, the terrifying realization that the bonds that held us together were perhaps far more fragile than we had ever imagined. It was about the darkness that lurked within the human heart when pushed to the brink. I remembered other hard winters, times when the snows lay just as deep, when food was almost as scarce. But then, there had been a spirit of unity, of shared sacrifice. We had pooled our resources, helped the weakest among us, found strength in our collective endurance. There had been hardship, yes, but there had also been compassion. Now, compassion seemed to be the first casualty, frozen dead by the icy grip of suspicion. The truth that no one dared to speak was a multifaceted thing. It was the truth of their own gnawing hunger, a hunger that might, under different circumstances, drive them to similar acts of desperation. It was the truth of their fear of the unknown thief, fear of each other, fear of the bleak, uncertain future. It was, perhaps for some, the uncomfortable truth of a lingering doubt about Elric's guilt, a doubt they dared not voice for fear of implicating themselves or someone they knew. And for others, it was the shameful truth of their own relief that the blame had fallen on someone else, someone expendable, someone whose absence would not be greatly mourned. This veil of silence, this web of suspicious glances, was more chilling than the fiercest blizzard. The storm outside had passed, but a new, internal storm was gathering, a storm of fear and mistrust that threatened to tear our village apart from within. The missing bread had not just left an empty space on a windowsill, it had left an empty space in the heart of Ashworth, a void where trust and community had once resided. As I sat by my own meager fire that evening, the shadows dancing on the rough-hewn walls of my cottage, I felt a profound sense of loneliness, a desolation that went deeper than my solitary existence. I was alone. Yes. But now, the entire village felt alone, each soul an isolated island in a sea of suspicion. The warmth of my small fire could not reach the chill that had settled in my heart. I thought of Elric, wherever he was hiding in the frozen depths of the old wood, or perhaps already succumbed to the cold and hunger. Had he been the thief? It almost didn't matter anymore. He had become a symbol, a catalyst, the real thief. I began to fear, Was the suspicion itself, stealing our humanity, our decency, our ability to see each other as neighbors, as fellow sufferers, rather than as potential threats. The night was quiet, the storm having moved on, leaving behind a pristine, starlit sky. But it was a deceptive quiet, a silence pregnant with unspoken fears and accusations. Ashworth was a village holding its breath, waiting. Waiting for what? I did not know. But as I looked out at the cold, glittering stars, I felt a premonition that this was only the beginning. The missing bread was but the first crack in the ice, and I feared that much worse was yet to come before this long, dark winter of our suspicion finally broke, if it ever did. The village of Ashworth was now a village of suspicion, and every shadow seemed to hold a new, unspoken threat. Days bled into one another following the unresolved disappearance of the bread, each dawn painting the snow-covered desolation of Ashworth in hues of gray that mirrored the mood of its few remaining inhabitants. The storm had long passed, but the chill it left behind was more than just a matter of frost and ice. It was a coldness that had settled deep within our hearts, freezing the warmth of fellowship, crystallizing suspicion into hard, sharp shards. Young Elric remained missing, a phantom figure whose absence only fueled the festering paranoia. Some whispered he had succumbed to the elements in the old wood, a fitting end for a thief. Others, their eyes darting nervously towards their own dwindling stores, muttered that he must have had help, that the true evil still walked among us, cloaked in false innocence. The silence of Chapter 2, that heavy blanket of unspoken accusations and fearful conjectures, persisted. But it was a silence that grew heavier with each passing day, pregnant with an unvoiced desperation. Food was scarcer than ever. The meager reserves we had guarded so jealously were now perilously close to exhaustion. Faces grew gaunter, tempers shorter, and the furtive, suspicious glances became more frequent, more openly hostile. We were a village consuming itself from within, the hunger in our bellies matched only by the hunger for a resolution, for a target upon which to vent our collective fear and misery. It was in this atmosphere of simmering dread, on a morning when the winter sun seemed particularly weak and distant, that the idea first took root. I heard it first as a murmur amongst a small group huddled near the frozen village well, their breath pluming like worried ghosts in the frigid air. Master Giles, the sour-faced farmer, was speaking, his voice low but carrying a strange, fervid intensity. He spoke of the old ways, of times when our ancestors faced trials beyond their understanding, and how they sought answers not from men, but from forces older, more profound. Then, Miller Thomas, his face still a mask of grim anger over his lost bread and the subsequent gnawing hunger his family endured, took up the cry. His voice, louder and more desperate, resonated through the thin, cold air. "We need a sign," he declared, his fist striking the icy rim of the well. "Reason has failed us. The boy is gone, or hidden. And the thief, if it was not him, still mocks us. We need a judgment that cannot be swayed by lies or deceit." Someone, I believe it was old Widow Elmsworth, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of ancient memory and current fear, uttered the words that would send a fresh shiver down the spine of Ashworth. "The bell. We must consult the bell." It was not the church bell, whose voice had fallen silent with the spirit of Father Thomas. This was another bell, an ancient, brooding relic that stood, or rather, hung in the crumbling, long-disused meeting hall at the very heart of the village square, a place most of us avoided, for it was said to carry the chill of ages, the sorrow of forgotten generations. As one of the oldest in Ashworth, I remembered the tales of the bell, passed down from my grandfather, who had heard them from his. It was cast from a dark, unfamiliar metal, pitted and green with verdigris, its surface covered in strange, unreadable symbols that no scholar who had ever chanced upon our remote village had been able to decipher. It was said to be far older than Ashworth itself, a relic from a time beyond memory, perhaps even from before the old gods were supplanted by the new. Its voice, on the rare occasions it had been rung in centuries past, was not the clear, resonant peal of a church bell, but a deep, guttural clang, a sound that seemed to vibrate not in the ears, but in the very bones, unsettling the soul, and it carried a particular, grim association. It was known as the Bell of Judgment, or sometimes, more ominously, the Plague Bell, for legend held that its last significant use had been during the Great Sickness that had swept through these lands generations before my grandfather's, a plague that had left Ashworth a near-empty ghost town, much as this current winter threatened to do. In those dark days, it was whispered, the bell had been used not to warn or to mourn, but to judge, to identify those touched by the plague's shadow, those who carried its invisible taint. How it did so? The legends were vague and contradictory. Some said its tone would change when rung by an afflicted hand. Others claimed that the guilty, or the diseased, could not bear to stand in its presence when it tolled, that its sound would drive them to madness or confession. For centuries, it had hung silent, a brooding monument to a dark past, its rope frayed, its presence largely ignored, save for the frightened whispers of children who dared each other to touch its cold, forbidding surface. Now, in our desperation, in our inability to find a rational solution to the simple theft of a loaf of bread, the village was turning to this relic of a more superstitious, more brutal age. The idea, once voiced, spread with the terrifying speed of a forest fire. It preyed upon our collective fear, our hunger for certainty in an uncertain world. Miller Thomas seized upon it with the ferocity of a drowning man clutching at a rotten branch. Yes, he cried, his eyes alight with a wild hope. The bell will tell us. It will not be deceived. It will show us the thief. Mixed with a morbid, fearful excitement, ran through the small crowd. Even those who might have scoffed at such superstition in ordinary times found themselves swayed. Our own attempts at justice had failed. The community was fracturing under the weight of suspicion. Perhaps this ancient, mystical object truly did possess some power, some forgotten wisdom that could pierce the veil of lies and reveal the truth. I felt a profound sense of dread. This was not justice, it was a descent into a primal fear, a relinquishing of reason to the whims of an inanimate object, and the desperate interpretations of a terrified populace. This is folly, I said, my voice barely a croak against the rising tide of their desperate conviction. It is just a piece of metal, old and forgotten. It cannot judge. It can only sow more fear, more division. Dismissed as the ramblings of an old man out of touch with the urgency of the moment, Master Giles fixed me with a hard stare. And what is your solution, Elias? To let us starve while thieves among us grow fat. To live in constant fear, eyeing our neighbors as if they were wolves. The bell is all we have left. It is a legacy from those who survived the last great death. Perhaps they knew things we have forgotten. The appeal to ancestral wisdom, the hint of forgotten powers, it was a potent brew for minds already weakened by hardship. A consensus, born of desperation, quickly formed. The bell would be consulted. The judgment would take place. The question then became how. How would this silent, ancient sentinel deliver its verdict? For a day and a night, the village buzzed with hushed, fearful debate. Some proposed that every man, woman, and child capable of standing should be made to strike the bell its tone. They argued, would alter for the guilty, becoming harsh and discordant. Others suggested a more passive trial, all suspects, and in truth, by now, everyone was a suspect in someone else's eyes, should be made to stand beneath the bell, while it was rung by an elder, perhaps myself, or even Father Thomas, if he could be roused from his spiritual torpor. If the bell remained silent, or told cleanly, they were innocent. If it produced a cracked, mournful sound, or, as some of the more lurid tales suggested, If it were to inexplicably toll of its own accord in their presence, their guilt would be manifest. It was this latter method, with its terrifying overtones of supernatural intervention, that seemed to capture the village's grim imagination. The idea of the bell itself, imbued with some ancient, sentient power, actively identifying the culprit, was both horrifying and deeply compelling. The preparations, if they could be called that, began the following morning. The meeting hall, a dilapidated wooden structure whose roof sagged and whose windows were mostly boarded over, had to be accessed. Its great oak door, swollen and warped by years of damp and neglect, was forced open with crowbars and sheer effort, the sound of splintering wood echoing ominously in the cold, still air. I was among those who entered, drawn by a morbid sense of duty, a need to witness this descent into what I feared would be a tragic farce. The interior was vast, dark, and filled with the accumulated dust and debris of a century. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, hung from the high rafters. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, of old wood, of something else, a faint, metallic tang that I recognized as the bell itself, even before my eyes adjusted to the gloom. It hung in the very center of the hall, suspended from a massive, blackened oak beam by a thick, verdigris-covered chain. It was larger than I remembered from my childhood explorations, perhaps 6 feet in height, its surface dark and forbidding, those strange, eroded symbols seeming to writhe in the flickering lantern light. The frayed end of its ancient rope lay coiled on the dusty floor beneath it. Like a dead serpent, a hush fell upon those of us who had entered. The bell's presence was palpable, a cold, ancient power that seemed to radiate outwards, filling the vast, empty space. Even Miller Thomas, his face usually a mask of bullish anger, seemed subdued, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. It was decided that the judgment would take place at noon the next day. Every remaining villager, save for the very young or the gravely ill, of whom there were pitifully few left, who were not already dead, would be summoned, one by one, starting with those most openly suspected, though the criteria for this were vague, and shifted with each whispered conversation. They would be made to stand. The rest of us would watch, in silence, waiting for the ancient metal to deliver its verdict. As we left the gloom of the meeting hall and stepped back into the pale winter sunlight, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The air in the village was thick with a new kind of tension, a morbid anticipation that was almost unbearable. Furtive glances were exchanged, no longer just of suspicion, but of a dawning, terrible fear. Who would be chosen first? Whose guilt, or innocence, would be laid bare by this silent, implacable judge? That night, few in Ashworth slept. The silence of the village was broken by the occasional muffled sob, the murmur of a desperate, fearful prayer, the restless stirring of souls tormented by hunger, by grief, and now, by the looming shadow of the bell of judgment. I sat by my own fire. The image of that dark, ancient bell seared into my mind. I thought of Elric, the boy who had vanished, the catalyst for this madness. Was he out there somewhere, freezing and starving, unaware of the strange, superstitious ritual being prepared in his name? Or was he already dead, his small ghost perhaps the only innocent observer of our collective folly? I remembered the old tales of the plague bell, tales of its unerring ability to find the hidden sickness. But this was not a sickness of the body we were trying to root out, it was a sickness of the soul. A contagion of fear and suspicion that had already taken firm hold, and I doubted very much if any bell, however ancient, however powerful its legend, could cure that. The eve of the judgment was a long and terrifying one. The bell of Ashworth, silent for generations, was about to speak again, and I, Elias, the old blacksmith, feared that its voice, when it finally came, would toll not for justice, but for the final, tragic unraveling of our once proud, now broken village. The weight of its impending pronouncement hung heavy over us all. A silent, metallic promise of revelations yet to come. The morning of the bell's judgment dawned upon Ashworth with a chilling, unnatural stillness. The wind, which had howled for days, had finally died, leaving the air sharp, cold, and eerily silent, as if the very elements were holding their breath in anticipation of the grim proceedings. The sun, a pale disk in a sky the color of tarnished silver, offered no warmth, only a stark, unforgiving light that illuminated the haggard faces and fearful eyes of the few villagers who dared to emerge from their homes. A sense of morbid predestination hung heavy over us all, a feeling that today, one way or another, a reckoning was at hand. I had spent a restless night, the image of the ancient, brooding bell dominating my troubled thoughts. The idea of subjecting a child, any child, to such a terrifying, superstitious ordeal filled me with a profound unease. But what could I, an old man whose words of caution had already been dismissed, do against the tide of collective fear and desperation? Ashworth was a village teetering on the brink, and its inhabitants were grasping at any straw, however flimsy, that promised a semblance of order, a scapegoat for their suffering. Just as the sun had climbed a hand's breadth above the jagged peaks of the old wood, a shout went up from the direction of the abandoned cooperage, a dilapidated outbuilding on the very edge of the village. It was Master Guileless' voice, sharp and triumphant. "We have him. The little rat is found." Elric. They had found Elric. I joined the small, grim procession of villagers making their way towards the cooperage. My heart was heavy, my steps reluctant. I saw him then, dragged from the shadows of the decaying structure by two of the larger village men, Master Giles prodding him from behind with a thick staff. Elric was a pitiful sight. He was caked in dirt and what looked like old sawdust, his already ragged clothes torn further, his face streaked with grime and frozen tears. He was shivering violently, not just from the cold, but clearly from terror. His large, dark eyes, usually so wary, were now wide with a hunted, animalistic fear as he looked at the ring of hard, accusing faces surrounding him. He was so thin, so frail. He looked as though a strong gust of wind might blow him away. He clutched something small and dark to his chest, a bundle of rags perhaps, holding onto it with a desperate tenacity. Caught him hiding like the vermin he as Giles proclaimed, his voice ringing with self-righteous satisfaction. Tried to burrow himself under a pile of old hides. The little sneak. His face a mask of fury. Does he still have it? The thieving whelp. Pressing himself back against his captors, but he said nothing. His silence, his utter terror, seemed only to confirm his guilt in the eyes of the villagers. They began to shove him towards the meeting hall, their movements rough, their voices a low, angry growl. No one spoke a word of kindness. No one offered a gesture of comfort. He was already condemned in their hearts. The meeting hall was even colder and gloomier than it had been the day before. The villagers, perhaps 30 or so souls in all, a stark testament to how our numbers had dwindled, crowded into the vast, dusty space, their breath misting in the frigid air. The great, dark bell hung in the center, a silent, ominous presence, its ancient metal seeming to absorb what little light filtered in through the grimy, boarded windows. The atmosphere was thick with a mixture of fear, morbid anticipation, and a desperate, almost hysterical need for this ordeal to be over, for a verdict to be delivered. Miller Thomas, taking upon himself the role of prosecutor, or perhaps high priest of this strange ritual, stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, was unnaturally loud in the echoing hall. "We are gathered here," he announced, "before the sacred bell of our ancestors, the bell that has guarded Ashworth through plague and hardship, the bell that knows truth from falsehood. Today, it will speak again. It will show us the thief who stole bread from starving children, the coward who lurks among us. His words falling like hammer blows in the tense silence. Each villager, starting with those who had first raised the alarm and then moving outwards, would approach the bell alone. They would place their right hand upon its cold surface and speak their name. If they were innocent, the bell would ring. A clear, pure tone, a sign of its affirmation. If they were guilty, he paused for dramatic effect, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces. If they are guilty, he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the bell will remain silent, or worse, it will toll with a sound of doom. A sound that will mark them for all to see. The superstition, the fear, was palpable. This was no longer just about a missing loaf of bread. This was about the very soul of the village, about rooting out an evil that threatened to consume them all. The ritual began. The first to approach was Mistress Martha, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping. She touched the bell with a trembling hand, her whispered name barely audible. For a moment, there was an absolute, heart-stopping silence. Then, a faint, almost ethereal shimmer of sound, a low, resonant hum, seemed to emanate from the ancient bronze, more a vibration felt in the bones than a true ring. It was enough. A sigh of relief went through the crowd. Martha was innocent. One by one, they came forward. Master Giles, his face grim, touched the bell, and again. That faint, prolonged hum, like a drawn-out sigh. Widow Elmsworth, her hands gnarled with age, elicited a similar response. With each person who touched the bell and for whom it produced this subtle, resonant vibration, the villagers' belief in its power seemed to grow. They began to murmur amongst themselves, their eyes shining with a strange, feverish light. The bell was working. It was discerning. It was speaking the truth. I watched, my heart growing heavier with each passing judgment. It was clear to me, with my blacksmith's understanding of metal and sonority, that the bell was not ringing in any true sense. The faint hum was likely caused by the warmth of a hand upon the intensely cold bronze, causing minute vibrations, or perhaps simply the power of suggestion. The desperate willingness of the villagers to hear what they so desperately wanted to hear. But they were beyond such rational explanations. They were in the grip of a powerful, collective delusion. Then came the turn of those who were, by some unspoken consensus, deemed more suspect. Young Peter, the cobbler's son, who had been seen near Miller Thomas' cottage on the night of the storm, approached with evident terror, his face ashen. He touched the bell, and the now familiar hum resonated. He almost collapsed with relief. Others followed, each proving their innocence, each faint vibration of the ancient metal tightening the invisible noose round young Elric, who stood guarded, shivering, his eyes wide with a terror that was heartbreaking to behold. Finally, only Elric remained. The silence in the meeting hall was absolute, save for the ragged sound of the boy's breathing and the low, guttural cawing of the crows that had begun to gather on the roof outside, as if drawn by the scent of impending doom. Now, the boy Miller Thomas commanded, his voice devoid of any pity, bring forth the whelp. Let the bell speak his truth. Stumbling, his small, bare feet scuffing on the dusty floor, he looked impossibly small, impossibly fragile, standing there in the shadow of that great, dark bell. He was weeping silently now, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He kept clutching that small, dark bundle to his chest, as if it were his only anchor in a world that had turned so utterly against him. Touch the bell, Boy Thomas ordered, his voice harsh. Touch it, and let us hear its judgment. His eyes filled with an unutterable terror. He shook his head. A small, almost imperceptible movement. "Number. Please," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. I didn't do it." Prodding him with his staff, with a small, choked sob, Elric reached out a trembling, dirt-stained hand. It hovered for a moment before the cold, pitted surface of the bronze. Then, with a visible effort of will, he pressed his small palm against it. The silence in the hall was a living thing, a suffocating entity that pressed down on us all, stealing the very air from our lungs. Every eye was fixed on the bell, on the small, terrified boy who stood before it. We waited. 1 second. 2. 5. An eternity. The bell remained utterly, profoundly silent. No hum, no vibration, nothing. Just the cold, dead silence of ancient metal, and the echoing, terrified silence of the boy. A collective gasp, a sigh of indrawn breath, swept through the crowd. It was a sound of terrible, vindicated certainty. The bell had spoken, or rather, its silence had spoken, and its verdict was clear. Elric, his hands still pressed against the cold bronze, seemed to shrink into himself, his small body racked with silent sobs. The bundle he had been clutching fell from his other hand, unnoticed, onto the dusty floor. Guilty, the word was a roar, erupting from Miller Thomas' throat, a sound of savage triumph. The bell does not lie. He is the thief. The demon seed. A wave of condemnation washing over the terrified child. Guilty. Guilty. He is the one their faces, moments before taut with fear and uncertainty, were now contorted with a righteous fury, a perverse relief that their suspicions had been confirmed, that their enemy had been unmasked. I felt a cold despair wash over me, a sickness in the pit of my stomach. This was not justice. This was a lynching, sanctioned by superstition, fueled by fear and hunger. The truth that the bell had supposedly rung was a lie, a terrible, tragic perversion. Its silence was not a judgment on Elric, but a judgment on us all, on our willingness to sacrifice a helpless child on the altar of our own desperation. Elric sank to his knees, his small body shaking uncontrollably, his face buried in his hands. He was no longer just an accused thief, he was a condemned soul, marked by the silence of the bell. Abandoned by God and man, the villagers began to close in, their voices a rising tide of anger and menace. "What shall we do with him?" someone cried. "He cannot go unpunished. A thief's due. An example must be made." Dark bundle that had fallen from Elric's grasp. It had come partially unwrapped, and peeking out from the rags, I saw not a stolen loaf of bread, but something else entirely, something small, and feathered, and still. A dead bird, a sparrow, perhaps, its tiny body stiff with cold, but no one else seemed to notice. They were too consumed by their righteous fury, by the ringing truth of the bell's damning silence. The chapter of the bell of judgment had reached its terrible climax. Elric was condemned, and as I looked at the ring of vengeful faces surrounding that small, broken child, I knew that whatever happened next, the true judgment of this day would not be upon Elric, but upon the blighted, fear-stricken souls of the villagers of Ashworth. The bell had remained silent, but the repercussions of that silence, I feared, would echo through our desolate village for a long time to come. The silence that had followed the bell's damning pronouncement, or rather, its damning lack of one for young Elric, was short-lived. It was shattered by a guttural roar of vindicated fury from Miller Thomas, a sound that seemed to unleash the pent-up fear and rage of every man and woman gathered in that cold, dusty meeting hall. "Guilty," he bellowed again, his face contorted, spittle flying from his lips. "The bell has spoken. The little demon is the thief." A permission slipped for the villagers to unleash their own torrent of condemnation. Make him pay, someone shrieked from the back. An example must be made, another voice, raw with hunger and anger, agreed. He stole from starving children. He deserves no mercy. A small, crumpled heap on the floor, his thin shoulders shaking with uncontrollable sobs, was hauled roughly to his feet by Master Giles and another stout farmer. The boy offered no resistance, his spirit seemingly crushed beyond repair. He was a leaf in a tempest, utterly at the mercy of their collective wrath. The small, dark bundle he had clutched so fiercely, the bundle I alone had recognized as containing a dead bird, lay forgotten on the floor. A tiny, poignant testament to a truth no one else had seen, or perhaps had cared to see. My own throat was tight with unspoken words, with the image of that small, stiff sparrow. But to speak of it now, in this cauldron of righteous fury, it would be like trying to calm a tsunami with a whisper. My intervention would be drowned, and I, too, might be swept away by their rage. A cacophony of voices rose, each suggesting a different, harsher punishment. Some called for a public whipping, others for him to be driven out into the old wood to fend for himself. A certain death sentence in this brutal winter. The air thrummed with a bloodlust that was terrifying to behold in men and women I had known my entire life as decent, hard-working folk. It was as if the pestilence of suspicion had finally consumed their reason, leaving only a raw, primal urge for retribution. It was Widow Elmsworth, her face a mask of grim piety, her voice surprisingly strong for her advanced years, who finally proposed the sentence that would cast the longest, coldest shadow over Ashworth. The ice cellar, she declared, her words cutting through the din like shards of glass. Let him be confined in the ice cellar, as was done in the old times, for those who betrayed the village, for those who brought ruin upon us. The ice cellar. The name itself seemed to carry a chill, a weight of forgotten history and unspoken dread. Even Miller Thomas, his face still flushed with anger, seemed to pause, a flicker of something unease, respect for ancient tradition, crossing his features. The ice cellar of Ashworth was not merely a place for storing ice harvested from the river in deeper winter, though that had been one of its more mundane uses in recent generations. It was far older, a relic from a time when Ashworth was little more than a fortified outpost against the wildness of the land and the savagery of men. It was dug deep into the earth beneath the northern foundations of the old, now collapsed watchtower, a structure that predated even the meeting hall. Its entrance was a heavy, iron-banded oak door, set almost flush with the frozen ground, usually half buried in snow and forgotten for months on end. Inside, as I knew from my own childhood explorations undertaken with a mixture of bravado and terror, lay a series of narrow, stone-lined chambers, perpetually cold, perpetually dark, the air thick with the scent of damp earth, mold, and something else, a faint, lingering chill that was more than just the absence of warmth. Legend, passed down through hushed whispers from one generation to the next, held that the ice cellar had served a grimmer purpose in those bygone, brutal eras. It was there, they said, that traitors to the community, spies, or those who had committed crimes deemed heinous enough to threaten the very survival of Ashworth, were confined. It was a place of slow, agonizing punishment, a tomb for the living. Some tales spoke of prisoners forgotten, their bones discovered centuries later. Others hinted at darker things, of madness bred in the unending cold and darkness, of unearthly sounds echoing from its depths. It was, in essence, Ashworth's dungeon, its oubliette, a place where the village's most terrible justice was meted out. To condemn Elric, a child, to such a place for the theft of a loaf of bread seemed a monstrous perversion of justice, a grotesque inflation of his supposed crime. Yet, Widow Elmsworth's words had resonated with something deep and primal within the villagers. In their eyes, Elric's act, committed in a time of such dire scarcity, was indeed a betrayal, a blow against their collective survival. By invoking the ice cellar, she had elevated his petty theft to an act of treason against the starving community. 7 days, Miller Thomas pronounced, his voice regaining its harsh authority, the brief flicker of unease gone. 7 days in the ice cellar, with the bread he stole, and water enough only to keep him from death's immediate door. Let him contemplate his sin in the cold and the dark. Let him understand the suffering he has brought upon us. There were no dissenting voices now. My own heart felt like a leaden weight in my chest. 7 days, for a boy so small, so frail, in that freezing, lightless pit. It was a death sentence, albeit a slower, more agonizing one than being driven into the old wood. The procession to the ice cellar was a somber, silent affair. 2 men, Master Giles among them, dragged a still shivering Elric, his earlier resistance completely gone, his small body limp with terror and resignation. Another carried a single, coarse loaf of bread, whether it was the actual missing loaf, or one baked anew as a cruel symbol. I could not tell. In a small, stoppered clay jug of water, the rest of the villagers followed, their faces grim, their eyes holding a mixture of grim satisfaction and a dawning, fearful apprehension, even in their anger. Some, I thought, were beginning to feel the weight of what they were about to do. The entrance to the ice cellar was, as expected, almost entirely buried in snow. It took several men with shovels nearly an hour to clear it, their grunts and curses echoing in the otherwise silent afternoon. Finally, the heavy, iron-banded door was exposed, its ancient wood dark and forbidding, its iron hinges groaning in protest as they were forced open. A blast of frigid, musty air, carrying the scent of centuries of cold and darkness, billowed out, making several villagers recoil. Elric, when he saw that black, gaping maw leading down into the earth, let out a small, animalistic cry of pure terror and tried to pull away, but his captors held him fast. He was so small, so utterly helpless against their adult strength. They dragged him to the threshold, his bare heels scraping against the frozen ground. "Here is your feast," Thief Miller Thomas said, thrusting the loaf of bread and the jug of water into the boy's trembling hands. "May it sustain you through your repentance." His voice was laden with a sarcasm that made my stomach turn. Then, with a rough shove, Elric was pushed into the darkness. We heard him stumble, a small cry, and then silence. Master Giles slammed the heavy oak door shut. The sound was like a coffin lid closing. 3 massive iron bolts, rusted but still serviceable, were shot home with a clang that seemed to reverberate through the very soul of Ashworth. The villagers stood there for a moment, in the cold, fading light of the afternoon, staring at the sealed door as if mesmerized. Then, one by one, they began to drift away, their faces averted, their shoulders hunched, the brief, savage fire of their righteous anger seemingly extinguished, leaving behind only the cold ashes of unease. Had justice been done, or had they merely committed a greater crime? A crime against a child, a crime against what little remained of their own humanity. I was among the last to leave, my gaze fixed on that terrible door, behind which a small boy now faced an ordeal I could scarcely bear to imagine. The image of Elric's terrified face, his eyes wide with a silent plea for a mercy that had not been granted, was seared into my mind, and the memory of that small, dead bird he had clutched so desperately, a secret I now carried alone, felt like a burning coal in my heart. What small, innocent comfort had he sought in that tiny, frozen creature, only to have it be the prelude to this new, far greater suffering. As I walked back to my own cold, empty cottage, the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in streaks of blood red and bruised purple. The village was quiet once more, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a shared, unspoken guilt, the silence of a community that had chosen to sacrifice one of its weakest members on the altar of its own fear and hunger. 7 days, 7 nights, in the freezing, lightless dark of the ice cellar, with only a loaf of bread, a cruel reminder of his alleged crime, and a meager jug of water for sustenance. I, Elias, who had seen so much of life's hardship, of winter's cruelty, found it hard to believe that young Elric could possibly survive such a trial. The first night of his confinement fell upon Ashworth like a shroud. I sat by my fire, feeding it sparingly, listening to the wind that had begun to rise again, its mournful sigh seeming to echo the boy's imagined cries from the depths of the earth. The bread I ate that night, my own carefully hoarded ration, tasted like ash in my mouth. The warmth of my hearth felt like a betrayal. The ice cellar, a place of ancient punishment, now reactivated by modern desperation, a chapter of Ashworth's dark history, I feared, was about to be rewritten with the innocent blood, or the frozen breath, of a child. And we, the villagers, were all complicit in its inscription. The 7 days ahead stretched before my mind's eye like an eternity of cold, dark suffering. The days following young Elric's entombment in the ice cellar crawled by with an agonizing slowness, each one a fresh layer of frost upon the already frozen heart of Ashworth. A grim, suffocating quiet had settled over the village, a silence far more profound than the mere absence of storm. It was the silence of a shared, unspoken guilt, the silence of a community that had enacted a terrible, desperate justice and now lived in the cold shadow of its own deed. The wind still sighed through the eaves of the cottages, but now its mournful voice seemed to carry a new, more personal lament, perhaps for the boy suffering in the darkness beneath the earth, or perhaps for the collective soul of our dying village. I, Elias, found little rest. My small cottage, usually a haven of solitary peace, felt more like a prison cell. The image of Elric's terrified face as the heavy door of the ice cellar boomed shut was a constant, unwelcome guest in my thoughts. 7 days. The sentence echoed in my mind. 7 days in that frigid, lightless pit, with only a loaf of bread, that cursed symbol of his alleged crime, and a meager jug of water. Each sunrise brought a fresh pang of dread, a counting down of the hours that boy had to endure. If indeed he was still enduring, the villagers, those few of us who remained, moved like specters through the snow-covered lanes. Their faces were masks, drawn in tight, their eyes avoiding contact, as if fearing to see their own unease reflected in the gaze of another. The brief, savage unity of the judgment had fractured, replaced by a renewed, even deeper suspicion, though now it was laced with a shared, unspoken shame. No one spoke of Elric, no one mentioned the ice cellar. It was as if by ignoring it, by pretending it did not exist, they could somehow lessen the weight of their complicity. But the knowledge of what lay beneath that sealed oak door was a palpable presence, a cold, hard knot in the belly of Ashworth. It was during these long, dark days, and even longer, darker nights, that I began to notice a change in one of our number. A change so subtle at first that I dismissed it as a trick of my own weary, overwrought mind. But as the days of Elric's confinement wore on, the signs became undeniable. Someone else in Ashworth was suffering a torment that was not born of hunger or cold alone. It was Martha, Miller Thomas' wife, the woman whose shriek had first announced the theft of the bread, whose tears had fueled the initial wave of outrage in the immediate aftermath of Elric's condemnation. She, like her husband, had worn an air of grim, righteous satisfaction. The thief had been found. The bell had spoken. Justice, however harsh, was being served. But now, that certainty seemed to be eroding, crumbling away like the mortar in our decaying walls. I would see her by the well, her movements no longer sharp and efficient, but hesitant, almost furtive. Her face, always thin, had become gaunt, her eyes wide and shadowed, darting nervously as if she expected to see an accuser in every passing shadow. She who had once been quick with a word, sharp with her opinions, now fell silent if anyone approached. Her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She started at sudden noises, a dropped log, the caw of a crow, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a cry. Her husband, Thomas, seemed oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind, to her distress. He remained a bull of a man, his anger a hard, protective shell around him, his pronouncements on Elric's deserved fate still loud and uncompromising, whenever he found an ear to bend. But Martha was different. She was beginning to look like a hunted thing herself. One evening, as a premature dusk crept over the village, hastened by a fresh bank of leaden clouds, I saw her standing near the meeting hall. Not by the main door, but further back, in the shadows where the long, ominous shape of the ice cellar's sealed entrance was just visible as a darker mound beneath the snow. She was just standing there, a solitary, cloaked figure, motionless, staring towards it. There was an intensity in her posture, a terrible, focused stillness that sent a shiver down my spine. Was it grief for the boy? Remorse? Or something else? I remembered her initial cry. I only turned my back for a moment to see to the children. Had there been a doubt in her mind even then? A small, unspoken uncertainty that had been bulldozed by her husband's rage and the village's hunger for a culprit. The darkness she inhabited seemed to grow with each passing day of Elric's confinement. Not just the literal darkness of the long winter nights, but an internal darkness, a shadow that seemed to be consuming her from within. I would see a light burning late in their cottage, long after all other dwellings had succumbed to the curfew of exhaustion and despair. What kept her awake? Was it the wind, which now seemed to carry the faint, imagined moans from the earth? Or was it the gnawing of a conscience that refused to be silenced? The phrase from the old outline, Mat Caith et se mang tai, biti du ro vauvi, a truly guilty person begins to leak into the shell. Their composure breaking came back to me with a chilling force. Was this what I was witnessing in Martha? Was her outward shell of righteous anger, of a wronged wife, beginning to crack, revealing something else, something hidden and tormented beneath? One particularly bleak afternoon, perhaps the 4th or 5th day of Elric's imprisonment, I was in my smithy, trying to coax a little warmth from a reluctant fire. My thoughts, as always, on the boy in the cellar. The door creaked open and Martha stood there, a hesitant, almost ghostly figure in the dim light. "Elias," she said, her voice a dry whisper. I need to speak with you." I bade her enter. Surprised by her visit, she had not sought me out since before the storm. She sat on the rough wooden bench I offered, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the struggling flames. "It is Elric," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire. He will not survive it. Will he?" 7 days. In that place her words were a statement more than a question, her eyes holding a desperate, pleading look. "It is a harsh sentence for a child, Martha," I replied gently, "especially for one so frail, Thomas." "He is so sure," she whispered, twisting her fingers. The bell. It was silent. Everyone saw, everyone heard, or didn't hear her voice caught on a sob. "But the nights, Elias, the nights are so long. And the wind. It sounds like a child weeping." She looked at me then, her eyes wide and haunted. What if the bell was wrong? What if it was not Elric? The question hung in the air between us, heavy and dangerous. It was the first time anyone had dared to voice such a doubt aloud since the judgment. "The bell is an old thing, Martha," I said carefully, "made of metal. It knows nothing of guilt or innocence. It only knows what men choose to believe it knows. She stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she rose and fled, leaving me with a profound sense of unease. Her visit, her whispered doubts, confirmed my own growing suspicion that the truth of the missing bread was far more complex, far more painful, than a simple case of a hungry orphan's theft. That night, the wind howled with a renewed fury, and I lay awake, thinking of Martha. I imagined her in her own cottage, alone with her thoughts while her husband snored beside her, the darkness pressing in, the silence broken only by the storm and the insistent, gnawing voice of her own conscience. And it was then that I imagined her writing. One could almost see her. A precious scrap of parchment, perhaps saved from an old account book, or the back of a letter from a long-dead relative spread before her. A piece of charcoal, salvaged from the fire, clutched in her trembling hand. What would she write? This woman whose composure was so clearly breaking, whose soul was so evidently tormented. Confessions in the dark, the words formed in my mind. Silent confessions, written not for the eyes of the village, not for the judgment of men, but for the unburdening of her own tortured soul. Words that would perhaps acknowledge the small, gnawing doubt that had taken root when she first found the bread missing. Perhaps an admission of a moment's carelessness, a window left unlatched not by Elric, but by herself or one of her own children. Or perhaps something more, a truth she had seen, or suspected, but had been too afraid, or cowed by her husband's certainty, to reveal. I could not know for certain what she wrote, or even if she wrote at all. But the image of her, alone in the darkness, her hand moving across the parchment, tracing out the silent, desperate words of a truth too terrible to speak aloud, was overwhelmingly vivid. It was the confession of a soul beginning to leak, its protective shell cracking under the unbearable pressure of a shared guilt. Or perhaps a hidden, more personal one. The darkness of Ashworth was no longer just the absence of light. It was a breeding ground for secrets, for unspoken truths, for the silent unraveling of souls. Elric suffered in his icy tomb, a victim of our collective fear. But somewhere else in that benighted village, another soul was suffering its own private hell, its own dark night of the soul, perhaps committing to fragile parchment the silent confession that might one day, if it ever saw the light, unravel the terrible lie we had all chosen to believe. The air in Ashworth was thick not just with the cold, but with the weight of things unsaid, of truths hidden, of confessions written in the dark, waiting for a dawn that seemed as if it might never come. The days of Elric's confinement in the ice cellar stretched into a grim eternity, each one colder and darker than the last, both in the literal sense of the deepening winter and in the metaphorical chill that had settled upon the soul of Ashworth. The image of that small, terrified boy, swallowed by the black maw of the cellar door, haunted my waking hours and stalked my fitful, uneasy sleep. I, Elias, the old blacksmith, felt the weight of those passing days as keenly as if I were down there with him, sharing his frigid darkness, his gnawing hunger, his suffocating despair. The village remained a place of shuttered windows and fearful whispers, the brief, savage unity of the judgment having given way to an even more profound, if less vocal, disquiet. It was during this period of grim waiting, perhaps on the third or fourth night of Elric's ordeal, that I began to notice a change in my own daughter. Clara, my only child, a young woman of 17 winters, usually possessed of a quiet strength and a resilient spirit that had often been a comfort to my aging heart. But since Elric's condemnation, a new shadow had fallen upon her. She had grown quieter, more withdrawn, her usual tasks about our small cottage performed with a mechanical listlessness. Her eyes, normally clear and thoughtful, were often clouded, distant, as if fixed on some inner landscape of sorrow or unease. And then there were the candles. I noticed she was being unusually frugal with our dwindling supply, saving the smallest stubs, carefully melting down drips of wax to fashion crude new tapers. At first, I attributed it to the general scarcity, to her innate thriftiness. But then, I began to realize that these saved candles were not being used to light our own evenings. Our cottage often fell into an early gloom, while Clara seemed to be hoarding these small, precious sources of light for some other purpose. Late one night, unable to find solace in sleep, my mind tormented by visions of Elric in his icy prison, I heard the soft creak of our cottage door. Peering through a crack in my bedchamber partition, I saw Clara, cloaked and hooded, a single, newly fashioned candle shielded in her cupped hand, slip out into the frozen, moonless night. My heart constricted with a sudden, cold fear. Where was she going? The village was no place for a young woman to be wandering alone after dark. Not with the fear and suspicion that still hung heavy in the air. Not with the memory of the false prophet's disastrous exodus still fresh, even if that madness had mostly played out beyond our village confines. Driven by a paternal anxiety that overrode my own weariness, I pulled on my boots and cloak and followed her, keeping to the deepest shadows, my old bones protesting with every cautious step. The night was bitingly cold, the stars obscured by a thick, low-hanging cloud, the silence absolute save for the crunch of my own boots on the crusted snow and the distant, mournful sigh of the wind in the eaves of the abandoned cottages. Clara moved with a furtive grace, her small, shielded flame a tiny, defiant spark against the overwhelming darkness. Her path, I soon realized with a dawning, terrible understanding, was leading her towards the center of the village, towards the old meeting hall, towards the accursed ice cellar. My mind reeled. What was she doing? Surely, she wasn't foolish enough to try and open that heavy, bolted door, to attempt some ill-conceived rescue that would bring the wrath of the entire village down upon us, both. She did not go to the door itself. Instead, she stopped near the crumbling north wall of the meeting hall, the wall against which, deep beneath the earth, lay the chamber where Elric was confined. There, in a small alcove formed by fallen stones, sheltered from the worst of the wind, she carefully placed her small candle. Its flame flickered, struggled, then caught, casting a tiny, wavering pool of light upon the snow-covered stones and the dark, unyielding earth. Clara knelt before it, her hooded head bowed, her hands clasped. She was not trying to free him. She was keeping a vigil, a secret, solitary vigil of light and, I imagined, of prayer, for a boy whom the rest of Ashworth had condemned and abandoned to the darkness. I watched her from the shadows, my heart aching with a mixture of emotions of profound pride in her quiet courage, her defiant compassion, a sharp, paternal fear for her safety should she be discovered, and a deep, burning shame at my own inaction, my own cautious silence in the face of injustice. This girl, my daughter, possessed a moral fortitude that seemed to have deserted most of the grown men of our village. After a time, perhaps half an hour, when the candle had burned low, she carefully extinguished the last of its flame, retrieved the precious stub, and slipped away as silently as she had come. I waited until she was well clear before making my own way back to our cottage, my mind in turmoil. The next morning, I confronted her, my voice gentler than I had intended. "Clara," I said, as we shared our meager breakfast of thin porridge, "I saw you last night at the meeting hall." Nor did she deny it. She simply looked at me, her clear, honest eyes holding a quiet sorrow. "He is just a boy, Father," she said, her voice low but firm, "and he is alone in the dark. Perhaps a little light, even if he cannot see it, might make the darkness less absolute." "Child," I cautioned, though my heart swelled at her words. "If Miller Thomas, or Giles, were to see you—" A hint of bitterness in her tone. "They saw guilt in Elric because they needed to see it. But what if they were wrong? What if the bell? What if it lied?" Unspoken doubts. What if? Indeed. This exchange, this revelation of my daughter's secret compassion, stirred something in me, a restlessness, a need to understand the tangled roots of our village's current predicament. Later that day, while Clara was out attempting to snip some evergreen branches, for kindling for our firewood was nearly exhausted, I found myself rummaging through a chest that held the accumulated detritus of my long-life-old tools, scraps of leather, bundles of letters from kin long dead, and my journals. For years, since I was a young apprentice, I had kept a smithy journal, recording not just accounts of work done, of tools forged and mended, but also noteworthy events in the village, local lore, and my own private reflections. They were a haphazard history of Ashworth, written in my own rough hand. I had not looked at them in years. I pulled one out, its leather cover cracked and faded, its pages yellowed and brittle. I opened it at random, my eyes falling upon entries from a time long past, when I was a younger man, and my own father was still alive. I read of harvests, of weddings, of winter storms less fierce than this one. And then, my gaze fell upon a series of entries that made the blood run cold. They were dated some 40 years prior, during another dark winter, another time of sickness and fear, the winter fever that had claimed Elric's own parents, and many others. It was not the pestilence on the scale of the ancient plague that the bell was fabled to have judged, but it had been a terrible time nonetheless. Fear had gripped Ashworth then, too. And as I read my own faded script, a forgotten memory, a Bai Mitchin Ming shocking secret as the outline had foretold, rose from the pages like a vengeful ghost. The 10th day of the long frost I had written, my younger self's handwriting more forceful, yet tinged with an unease I could still feel across the decades. Another taken by the fever, Old Man Hemlock's youngest son. The village is mad with fear. There was talk today, talk of using the old bell. Master Thorn, the elder then, spoke against it. He said his own father told him the bell was unreliable, that in the great sickness of ages past, it had been known to stay silent for the truly ill, and to ring for those whose only sickness was fear in the hearts of their accusers. He said it was a thing of superstition, not of God's truth, and that our fear was making us foolish. My hand trembling, the bell, unreliable, known to be swayed by the fear of accusers, not by the guilt of the accused. Master Thorn, an elder I respected greatly in my youth, had warned against its use, a warning I had forgotten, a warning our village, in its current madness, had never known, or had chosen to ignore. But there was more. I read on, my heart pounding. A few entries later, after the worst of the winter fever had passed, I had recorded a conversation with Master Thorn, a confession almost, that he had shared with me in the quiet of my smithy. Master Thorn spoke to me today of the fever, and of the old bell. The entry read. He seemed burdened. He said that during the worst of it, when fear was at its peak, there had been an incident. A family, new to the village, outsiders, were blamed for bringing the sickness. Their meager stores of food were dwindling, much like ours now. A small sack of grain went missing from the communal store, a store already desperately low. The bell, despite Thorn's warnings, had been consulted. It had remained silent for the father of that unfortunate family. He was driven out, with his wife and child, into the deep snows. They were never seen again. A family, accused, condemned by the silent bell, driven out to die. The next lines chilled me to the core. Weeks later I had written, "When the thaw came, the missing sack of grain was found, hidden in the rafters of the very communal store from which it was taken." Rats, Thorne said. Or perhaps a villager, their own hunger overcoming their conscience, who then allowed the blame to fall upon the outsiders. Thorne never knew for sure, but the weight of that silence, the bell's silence, and the fate of that family, it haunted him to his dying day. He made me swear to remember, to warn others if ever such madness took root again. And I had forgotten. The diary slipped from my nerveless fingers. The shocking secret was not some grand conspiracy, but a testament to the fallibility of our judgment, the tragic history of our fear, and my own terrible lapse of memory, my own failure to uphold a solemn vow. The bell of judgment was not a divine oracle, it was a mirror, reflecting back the darkest parts of our own frightened souls, amplifying our suspicions, consecrating our prejudices. And Elric, like that forgotten family from 40 years past, was its latest victim. Clara found me there, slumped on the bench, the open diary at my feet. My face, I am sure, ashen. She picked up the journal, her eyes questioning. I could not speak. I could only point to the damning passage. She read it, her young face growing pale, her eyes widening with a horrified understanding. When she looked up at me, there were tears in her eyes, but also a new, steely resolve. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "Elric, we cannot leave him in that place. Not now. Not knowing this." My daughter had not only brought a flicker of light to Elric's darkness, but she had, by some unforeseen chain of events, unearthed a truth that threatened to shatter the very foundations of our village's cruel certainty. The bell had lied, or rather, we had lied to ourselves, using it as a divine excuse for our own human failings. And Elric was still in the ice cellar, the days of his sentence relentlessly counting down, the weight of our ringing truth pressing him ever closer to a fate he did not deserve. The shocking secret was out, at least between my daughter and me. But what? In this village consumed by fear and on the brink of starvation, could an old blacksmith and a girl with a candle possibly do with such a dangerous, earth-shattering truth? The revelation from my old journal lay between Clara and me like a physical weight, cold and heavy as the iron of the bell itself. The faded ink on those brittle pages had not just recounted a forgotten tragedy. It had exposed the rotten core of the justice that had condemned young. The bell of judgment, that revered and feared relic, was not an oracle of divine truth, but a fallible, perhaps even manipulative, instrument. Its pronouncements shaped less by heavenly wisdom than by earthly fear and human malice. And I, Elias, had held a key to this truth, a sworn promise to an old, respected elder, and had let it lie dormant, buried under the dust of years, until my own daughter's quiet courage had inadvertently led me back to it. The shame of my forgetfulness, my inaction, burned within me, a far more potent heat than my meager hearth fire could ever provide. Elric had been in that frozen tomb for 5 days now. 5 days and nights of unimaginable suffering. Each passing hour was a fresh accusation against my silence, against the village's brutal certainty. "We have to do something," Father Clara insisted, her voice low but vibrating with a fierce urgency. Her compassion for Elric, once a secret vigil of candlelight, had now been armed with a terrible knowledge. "We cannot let him perish down there, knowing what we know, knowing that the bell, that it's a lie." At the righteous fire in her young eyes, and felt a stirring of the old blacksmith's spirit within me, the part that knew how to take unformed metal and hammer it into something strong and true. But I also felt the weary caution of age, the chilling memory of the mob's fury, the understanding of how deeply entrenched their belief in the bell's judgment had become. "And what would you have us do, child?" I asked, my voice heavy. "March into the square and declare that the bell is a fraud, that their sacred justice is built on a foundation of forgotten deceptions and manipulated fear. They would call us mad. Or worse, Miller, Thomas, and Giles, they would not stand for it. They need Elric to be guilty." Her hands clenching, that family Master Thorn spoke of, driven out to die, based on a silent bell and a hidden truth. And now Elric, it is happening again. "You said you swore to Master Thorn to warn others if such madness took root." Gentle but piercing, she was right. I had sworn an oath, and in my dotage, in the slow decay of memory, I had failed it until her innocent compassion had prodded my conscience awake. The ashes of that old promise were now stirring, fanned by her youthful indignation. "The truth," I said slowly, sifting through the echoes of Master Thorn's long-ago words, "is a dangerous weapon in the hands of those who are not prepared to receive it. We need more than just an old man's faded diary entry. We need to understand how this bell became such a tool, how its history has been manipulated." In the days that followed, while Elric shivered in his icy prison and the village above maintained its uneasy, guilt-ridden silence, Clara and I embarked on a quiet, desperate quest, sifting through the ashes of Ashworth's past, listening for the echoes of forgotten truths. We spoke little to others, for every villager was now a potential informant, every conversation a potential risk. Our search was confined to my own small cottage, to the jumbled contents of old chests, to the even more jumbled recesses of my memory. I pulled out other old journals, account books where brief notes on village happenings were sometimes scrawled in the margins, bundles of letters from relatives who had lived and died in Ashworth generations ago. Clara, with her sharper eyes and quicker mind, helped me decipher the faded script, her brow furrowed in concentration as we pieced together fragments of our village's shadowed history. What emerged was not a single, clear narrative, but a tapestry of suggestive incidents, of half-forgotten grievances, of power wielded in subtle, often insidious ways. The bell, I began to realize, had always been more than just an ancient relic. It had been a focal point, a symbol, and like all symbols, its meaning could be shaped, its power directed, by those who understood the hearts of men, their fears, their superstitions. I recalled tales from my grandfather's time, not just of the great sickness, but of other periods of hardship, a failed harvest, a brutal winter raid by outlaws from the wild lands. In each instance, when fear and uncertainty were at their peak, the bell had somehow featured, not always as a judge, but as a rallying point, a means of forging a desperate, often temporary, unity. And sometimes, that unity was forged by identifying an enemy, an outsider, a scapegoat. The bell does not speak for God. Master Thorn's voice seemed to echo in my memory, from that long-ago conversation I had so diligently recorded. It speaks for the man who rings it, or for the fears of those who listen to its silence. A passing comment about a dispute over land rights between two prominent families in Ashworth, a dispute that had been settled by the old bell's wisdom after a series of unfortunate accidents had befallen one of the claimants. There was no detail, no accusation, but the implication hung heavy in the air, the bell's wisdom conveniently aligning with the interests of the more powerful party. It was just unreliable, Father Clara said one evening, her face pale in the flickering candlelight as she looked up from a particularly difficult passage in an old ledger. It feels like it was used deliberately. The truth that was gradually emerging was far darker than mere superstition. The bell was not just a relic of a credulous past, it was a tool. A tool for manipulating history, for silencing dissent, for conveniently assigning blame and thereby maintaining a certain order, a certain power structure within the village. The sacred tradition that Miller, Thomas, and Widow Elmsworth had invoked, was perhaps less about divine justice and more about a its true origins and workings obscured by layers of myth and fearful reverence. The plague era from which its legends supposedly stemmed now seemed less like a time of supernatural intervention, and more like a period of extremes. Who knew how many Elrics, how many outsider families had been condemned by its silence, their fates sealed, their stories erased or twisted to fit the prevailing narrative, all to preserve the illusion of order, the sanctity of the bell's pronouncements. The ashes of the past were yielding bitter truths. The echoes we heard were not of divine wisdom, but of human fallibility, of fear, and of a chilling, calculated manipulation. This realization filled me with a cold fury, a rage against the generations of deceit that had led us to this point, to the torment of an innocent boy in a freezing cellar. But it also filled me with a new, more potent fear. If the bell was indeed such a powerful symbol, so deeply entrenched in the village's psyche as an arbiter of truth, then to challenge it directly, to expose its history of manipulation, would be to challenge the very foundations of what little order remained. It would be to invite chaos, perhaps even violence, from those who had staked their actions, their very identities, on its supposed infallibility. Miller Thomas, Master Giles, Widow Elmsworth. They had not just condemned Elric, they had reaffirmed their belief in the bell, in the old ways, in a system that, however flawed, provided them with a sense of certainty in a world gone mad. To tell them now that their certainty was a lie, that their sacred relic was a fraud, would be to strip them of their last defense against the abyss. How would they react? Not with gratitude, I feared, but with a desperate, violent denial. "We have to be careful, Clara," I said, my voice low, as the 6th day of Elric's confinement drew to a close, the weight of this new understanding settling upon us. This truth, it is like holding a live coal. It can illuminate, but it can also burn. It can burn us, and it could burn down what little is left of Ashworth if we are not wise in how we reveal it. Tomorrow, he was to be brought out of the ice cellar. What then? Would they deem his punishment sufficient? Would they simply cast him out, a broken child, to fend for himself? Or would their fear, their need for a definitive end to the matter, demand something even more final? The truth about the bell, about Ashworth's history of manipulated judgment, was now clear to us. But it was a truth that was still largely silent, a dangerous echo in the minds of an old blacksmith and his daughter. The true challenge, the true test of courage, would be to find a way to make that echo heard. To let those ashes speak, without being consumed by the inferno that such a revelation might ignite. As darkness fell, cloaking Ashworth in its familiar shroud of winter gloom, I looked towards the meeting hall, towards the ice cellar where Elric lay. The bell above it was silent, as it had been for him. But its silence now felt different to me. It was no longer just the absence of sound, it was the heavy, pregnant silence of a long-held lie, a silence that we, somehow, had to find the courage to break. The echoes of the past were urging us towards a confrontation with the present, and the ashes of forgotten injustices were crying out for a truth that had been buried for far too long. Chikshtenri, Baala Chang 9 QSA Ko Chu Yun, a trial reversed in C Saith at Kui King Kung GG C5 A. Buak Lang Ashworth Phi C Mat Vijay Sai LDM QSA Chinnan. Chapter 9A Trial Reversed. Reluctant light, mirroring the heavy, apprehensive mood that had settled over the few of us who remained. 7 days, 7 eternities Elric had endured in the freezing, lightless hell of the ice cellar. A profound, almost unholy silence emanated from the vicinity of the meeting hall, as if the very earth around that accursed place held its breath. Today, the boy was to be brought forth. What would become of him, then, was a question that gnawed at the fringes of every villager's consciousness, a question no one dared to voice aloud. A small, Grim assembly had gathered in the square, their faces pinched with cold and a mixture of morbid curiosity and a dawning, unspoken dread. Miller Thomas stood at the forefront, his expression a mask of hard, unyielding authority, though I fancied I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, a weariness, perhaps, or a hairline crack in his bullish certainty. Beside him, Martha, his wife, was a pale, trembling wraith, her gaze fixed on the ground, her hands twisting endlessly in the folds of her ragged shawl. Her torment, so evident in the preceding days, seemed to have reached a fever pitch. Clara stood beside me, her small hand clutching mine, her knuckles white. The knowledge we shared, the truth about the Bell's fallible history, was a heavy burden, a dangerous secret that burned between us. We had spoken late into the night, agonizing over what to do, how to intervene without igniting a firestorm of denial and rage that could consume us all. We had no easy answers. Master Giles and two other stout men, their faces set in expressions of grim duty, moved towards the ice cellar door, the sound of the heavy iron bolts being drawn back, protesting with loud, rusty groans, echoed across the silent square, each clang a hammer blow against my already bruised heart. The oaken door creaked open, revealing a square of utter blackness, from which billowed a cloud of frigid, dank air that smelt of stone and despair. For a long moment, nothing. Then, a small, shuffling sound from within. Giles peered into the darkness, then reached in and, with a grunt, pulled Elric out into the pale morning light. A collective gasp went through the crowd, quickly stifled. The boy was a horrifying sight. He was caked in filth. His clothes, already ragged, now hanging in frozen tatters. His face was skeletal, his skin an almost translucent gray, stretched taut over his small bones. His eyes, when he slowly, painfully blinked them open against the unaccustomed light, were sunken, vacant, reflecting a horror that no child should ever have to witness, let alone endure. He could barely stand, his thin legs trembling uncontrollably, and Giles had to hold him upright. He did not weep. He did not speak. He seemed a creature beyond suffering, his spirit frozen, perhaps irretrievably broken. The small, dead bird I had seen him clutching was gone, lost somewhere in the darkness of his ordeal. Well, Boy Miller Thomas' voice was harsh, though it lacked some of its previous confident bluster. Have you repented your sin? Have 7 days in the darkness taught you the price of thievery? He merely stared blankly ahead, his gaze unfocused, as if seeing ghosts in the frigid air. It was at that moment, as Thomas was about to pronounce some further sentence, perhaps banishment, perhaps worse, that Martha, his wife, finally broke. A strangled sob escaped her, a sound of such profound, tearing anguish that it silenced every other breath in the square. She stumbled forward, falling to her knees in the snow before her husband, before the assembled villagers, before the broken child. No more, she cried, her voice raw, hysterical. I cannot bear it. It was not him. It was never him. Every eye turned to Martha, her face contorted with a grief and guilt that was terrible to behold. Thomas stared down at his wife, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. Martha, what madness is this? Have you taken leave of your senses? The bell itself condemned him. Beating her fists against the frozen ground, it was a lie. A terrible, wicked lie we told ourselves. The bread. Oh, the bread. Her voice dissolved into incoherent sobs. What are you saying? Woman, Master Giles demanded, his face darkening with suspicion. Speak plainly. Her eyes urging me. This was the moment, the crack in the facade. She speaks a truth that has been buried too long, I said, my own voice louder, firmer than I had expected. Stepping forward beside Clara, the Bell of Ashworth has a history of error, of being swayed by the fears of men. Not the will of God. I held up my old, battered journal. I have records from my youth, from Master Thorn, an elder many of you older folk will remember. He warned against using the bell for such judgments. He knew of innocence condemned by its silence in past times of hardship, of anger. Rippled through the crowd, Miller Thomas looked from his weeping wife to me, his face a mask of confusion and dawning fury. Lies. An old man's ramblings, a woman's hysteria. Elric is the thief. The bell proved it. Thomas. Martha lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes blazing with a desperate, reckless courage. Or did it merely confirm what you wanted to believe? What I wanted to believe. Because the truth was too shameful, too terrible to face. She took a ragged breath. The bread. The loaf that went missing from our windowsill. It was not stolen by Elric. It was taken by my own husband. Stunning the villagers into a new, deeper silence, all eyes turned to Miller Thomas, who stood as if turned to stone, his face draining of all color. Martha. You are overwrought, he stammered, but the conviction in his voice was gone. Number. Thomas, she cried, her voice gaining strength. No more lies. I can bear this guilt no longer. I saw you. I saw you take that last loaf. The one I had baked for our own children. I saw you sneak out with it that night. Into the storm. Miller, I pressed, my gaze fixed on his crumbling composure. For what desperate need did you condemn your own family to further hunger? And an innocent boy to the ice cellar? His bullish anger deflating like a pierced bladder, he looked around at the ring of accusing, disbelieving faces, at the small, broken form of Elric, at his weeping wife, and something within him seemed to shatter. It was for Agnes, he whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. Not Widow Elmsworth, but young Agnes, the cooper's daughter, a woman whose husband had perished in the early days of the deep cold, leaving her alone with a newborn babe, a woman whose beauty, in better times, had been a quiet light in our village. She and the child, they were starving. She had the milk fever. Her babe was wasting away. She would not ask for help. Her pride. I could not bear to see them perish. His gaze dropped to the snow. I took the bread for them. Only for them. I meant to replace it. I swear I did. But then the storm, the accusations, and Elric, he choked on the name. It was easier to let the blame fall on him. Of shock, of disgust, swept through the crowd, an illicit affair, stealing from his own children to feed a lover and her child. The scandal was as potent as the injustice. The man who had been so quick to condemn, so righteous in his fury, was himself the thief, his motives a tangled web of misplaced compassion, deceit, and profound moral cowardice. The truth, in all its ugly complexity, was finally out. The justice they had believed in, the infallible pronouncement of the bell, was a sham. They had been led, by their fear, by their hunger, by the confident bluster of a guilty man, to condemn an innocent. The weight of this realization settled upon them, crushing their self-righteousness, leaving them ashamed and uncertain. Clara, her face pale but resolute, stepped towards Elric, who still stood, a vacant, shivering statue, held up by a now deeply uncomfortable Master Giles. She gently unwrapped her own woolen scarf from her neck and, with infinite tenderness, draped it around the boy's thin shoulders. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like the first true act of compassion Ashworth had seen in many long, dark weeks. He is innocent, she said, her voice clear and unwavering, though it trembled slightly. He has suffered for a crime he did not commit. He has endured a punishment that none of us, not even the truly guilty, should inflict upon another soul, least of all a child. Now a broken, sobbing man himself, to the small, still form of Elric, to the ancient, silent bell in the meeting hall, the foundations of their world, their beliefs, their very understanding of right and wrong, had been shaken to the core. The trial of Elric was indeed reversed, but a new trial was just beginning, the trial of Ashworth itself. The village now had to confront not just the guilt of Miller Thomas, but its own collective guilt, its own descent into a fear that had bred cruelty and injustice. The bell of judgment had been silent when it mattered most. Or rather, its silence had been fatally misinterpreted, and the echoes of that silence, the echoes of a child's suffering and a community's shame, would resonate far beyond the confines of this single, bitter winter's day. The truth had emerged, raw and painful, and Ashworth would never be the same. The question that now hung heavy in the frigid air was, what would they do with it? And what would become of the boy who had been so terribly wronged? Chikshtenri, Bailey Chang Ten Vakung La Chang Kui King QSA Ko Chu Yun Theo BBCAC Ten Changban Ka Kung CCP. The final ring. And Martha's agonized corroboration descended upon the gathered villagers of Ashworth not as a cleansing storm, but as a slow, dawning horror, a creeping sickness of the soul. The righteous fury that had so recently animated them, that had fueled their condemnation of young Elric, now recoiled upon itself, leaving behind a hollow space filled with shame, disbelief, and a dawning, terrible understanding of their own culpability. They looked at Thomas, a broken, sobbing wreck now being half supported by a stunned Master Giles. They looked at Martha, still kneeling in the snow, her face buried in her hands, and they looked at Elric, a small, frail ghost of a boy, still shivering uncontrollably despite the scarf Clara had wrapped around him, his eyes vacant, reflecting the unimaginable terrors he had endured. Then the bell, someone stammered, the words barely a whisper, yet echoing loudly in the sudden, profound silence that had fallen. It was wrong. But a dawning, horrified statement of fact, the infallible oracle, the sacred bell of judgment, the bedrock of their desperate certainty, had been proven a fraud, or worse, a mirror reflecting their own ugliest impulses. The truth it had supposedly wrung, or withheld, was no truth at all. My own voice, when I finally found it, was heavy with the weariness of ages. The bell. My friends, I said, stepping forward, Clara at my side, my old journal held in my trembling hand, has always been a thing of metal and myth. Its power was never its own, it was the power we gave it. The power of our fears, our superstitions, and sometimes my gaze swept over the now uneasy faces. The power of those who knew how to manipulate such things for their own ends. Master Thorn, an elder wise in the ways of our villages past, knew this. He knew of innocence condemned by its silence, of truths twisted to serve convenience. He warned of it. A warning I, to my eternal shame, had forgotten until my daughter's compassion brought it back to light. The story of the family driven out to die. The grain later found, the bell's silence a convenient seal upon a hidden crime. Each word was a stone dropped into the deep, dark well of their collective conscience. Some looked away, unable to meet my gaze. Others stared, their faces paling as the implications of my words, and of Thomas' confession, fully registered. The immediate concern, however, was Elric. Clara, her face set with a fierce determination that belied her youth, was already moving towards him. He needs warmth, Father, she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. And food. Proper food. Not the bread of shame. She coaxed Elric to his feet, supporting his frail frame. A few other women, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and remorse, hesitantly stepped forward, offering a spare cloak, a murmured word of comfort. The hard shell of fear and accusation that had encased the village was beginning to crack, however painfully. Elric, still mostly unresponsive, allowed himself to be led away towards the relative warmth of Widow Elmsworth's cottage. She, surprisingly, having been among the first to offer shelter, her earlier pronouncements on divine punishment perhaps now tempered by a dawning, terrible understanding of human fallibility. With Elric removed from their immediate sight, the villagers turned their attention to Miller Thomas, his confession, his deceit, his illicit affair with young Agnes, who, it was now whispered, was indeed gravely ill, not with the winter fever, but with a wasting sickness that Thomas had desperately and secretly tried to combat with nourishing bread he could ill afford to spare or steal, had shattered their world. What was to be done with him? The ice cellar, their instrument of swift, brutal justice, now stood as a monument to their own folly. The bell, their oracle, was discredited. There were no shouts for vengeance now, no calls for immediate retribution, only a weary, confused anger, and a profound sense of having been utterly, terribly deceived not just by Thomas, but by themselves, by their own desperate need to believe in a simple solution, a single culprit. He must answer for what he has done, Master Giles said finally, his voice lacking its usual bluster, now heavy with a bewildered uncertainty. To Elric, to his own family, to all of us. When it eventually took place, was not held in the shadow of the bell. It was a quiet, somber gathering in what remained of the church nave, the crows cawing restlessly on the roof above, as if mocking their attempts at human justice. Thomas, stripped of his anger and his authority, confessed everything, his voice broken, his shame palpable. He spoke of his desperation for Agnes and her child, of his cowardice in letting Elric take the blame, of the gnawing guilt that had driven Martha to her own near madness. There was no easy punishment. Some argued for banishment, but to where? The world outside Ashworth was as harsh, as unforgiving, as our own isolated valley. Others spoke of forfeiture of his mill, of his goods. In the end, a kind of weary, pragmatic justice was decided. Thomas would work, under the direction of the remaining village elders, a council of which I was now, by default, a leading member, a role I accepted with a heavy heart, to provide for his own family, for Agnes and her child if they survived, and, crucially, to contribute to the care and sustenance of Elric, for as long as the boy needed it. His shame, his ostracism by a community he had so profoundly betrayed, would be a lifelong penance. Elric, slowly, began to recover, nursed by Clara and a repentant widow Elmsworth. The physical ordeal had been terrible, but the wounds to his spirit, I feared, would take far longer to heal. He remained silent for many weeks, his eyes holding a distant, haunted look. But Clara, with her patient kindness, her unwavering belief in him, gradually began to coax him back to the world of the living. She would bring him small treasures, a smooth stone from the riverbed, the first tiny snowdrop found blooming near Alara's forgotten garden, which she also tended now, and she would read to him from my old journals. Not the dark parts, but tales of past village festivals, of brave deeds, of simpler times. But the matter of the bell still hung heavy over Ashworth. It stood in the dark, dusty meeting hall, a silent, brooding reproach. As long as it remained, it was a symbol of their shame, of their manipulated fear, of a justice that had been a lie. Its presence was a constant, unwelcome reminder of their darkest hour. It was Clara, again, who voiced what many were beginning to feel. It must come down, Father, she said one evening, as spring was truly beginning to assert its gentle dominion over our valley. The air sweet with the scent of thawing earth and new growth. As long as it hangs there, we will never be free of what happened. It has a shadow. The decision was made. The bell of Ashworth, the plague bell, the bell of judgment, was to be destroyed. On a bright, clear morning, when the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the villagers gathered once more before the meeting hall. There was no anger this time, no fear, only a quiet, somber resolve. The heavy oak door was opened, and we entered the gloom. The bell hung as it always had, massive, dark, and imposing. As the village blacksmith, the task of its dismantling fell, in part, to me. With younger, stronger men, we set about the difficult, arduous work. We built a scaffold, secured ropes. The ancient chain that held it was thick, corroded, but strong. It took hours of concerted effort, of straining muscles and grunted commands, to finally, carefully, lower the great bronze behemoth to the dusty floor. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. There it lay, dislodged from its ancient perch, no longer a thing of our terror, but simply a massive, inert piece of metal, its strange symbols dulled with age and dust, its voice silenced. "What now, Master Giles?" asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Do we break it? Melt it down?" It had been a tool of deception. Yes, a focus for fear and superstition. But it was also a part of our history. A silent witness to generations of Ashworth's joys and sorrows, its triumphs and its failings. To simply obliterate it felt wrong. "No," I said slowly. "We will not destroy it in anger, as it was used in anger. We will take it down from its high place. We will bury it deep in the earth of the old wood, where it can trouble us no more. Let it rest, and let us learn from its silence." It took the better part of the day to drag the bell from the hall, to secure it to a makeshift sledge, and to haul it, with ropes and straining men, to a pre-dug pit deep within the woods. As it was rolled into the earth, it struck a stone, and a single, final, muffled clang echoed through the trees, the final ring faint, almost inaudible, like a last, choked sigh. Then, it was covered with earth, with stones, with fallen leaves, until no trace of it remained. Elric was there, watching, his small hand in Clara's. His face was still pale, his eyes still held a shadow. But as the last spadeful of earth covered the bell, I thought I saw a flicker of something new in his gaze, not peace. Perhaps, not yet, but the faintest stirring of a future released from the shadow of that terrible pronouncement. Ashworth did not magically heal. The scars of that winter, of the missing bread, of the bell's false judgment, were too deep. Miller Thomas lived as an outcast, his shame a heavy cloak. Young Agnes, sadly, did not long survive her illness, her child taken in by another family. The village was smaller, poorer, its trust in itself, in its traditions, irrevocably shaken. But life, stubbornly, continued. The spring deepened into summer. Crops were planted, however meager. Elric, under Clara's gentle care and my own gruff affection, slowly began to mend. He rarely spoke of his ordeal in the ice cellar, but sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, he would ask me to tell him stories of Ashworth's past, not of the bell, but of the ordinary folk, their struggles, their small joys. The bell was gone, but its silence, that terrible, damning silence that had condemned an innocent boy, and the subsequent silence that had followed its burial, echoed still. It echoed in the way we now dealt with disputes with more caution, more deliberation, less haste to judge. It echoed in the way we looked at our neighbors with a renewed, if fragile, sense of shared vulnerability. It echoed in the stories we would tell our children and our children's children, a permanent, cautionary whisper woven into the fabric of Ashworth's memory. The final ring of the bell had been a muffled clang in a forest grave, but the echo of its long, deceitful silence and the memory of the winter when fear and superstition had nearly destroyed us would reverberate through Ashworth for many generations to come, a somber reminder of the darkness that can gather when truth is lost, and the terrible cost of finding it again.